In the 16th century, the Spanish conquistadors tore into the new world of South America. Francisco Pizarro, an illiterate peasant soldier who conquered Peru, was perhaps the most ruthless of these soldiers of fortune. In 15 years, he and his followers killed thousands of indigenous Indians, wiped out the ruling Inca monarchy, and enslaved an empire. These acts were committed in pursuit of power, gold, and religious imperialism. Few men have changed the course of world history in such a violent, ruthless manner. Francisco Pizarro was born in 1478 in the poor rural Spanish community of Trujillo. His peasant mother abandoned him on the steps of the local church.
He was the illegitimate son of a Captain Gonzalo Pizarro, who was small-time gentry man from Spanish city of Trujillo.
In his youth, Pizarro showed little promise. Unable to read or write, Francisco became a swineherd. By the early 16th century, the Spanish conquest of the New World was underway. Ordinary men were bringing great fortunes back home. The harsh conditions in rural Spain produced tough, brutal mercenaries who were prepared to travel overseas and risk their lives in search of glory.
The one thing which set the imagination of men like Pizarro going was seeing in southwestern Spain not just Indians who were brought back, but gold objects. And they immediately saw an opportunity to, well, get rich quick, I suppose.
At the age of 23, Pizarro left Trujillo for the New World. He had become a soldier of fortune. In 1501, he arrived in the Americas and joined a series of expeditions to find land and gold. The conquistadors were waging a brutal, merciless war against vulnerable Indian natives in the name of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. This wasn't Renaissance Europe. It was a place where men killed their brothers for a gold ingot. For mercenaries like Pizarro, unimaginable power and wealth were on offer.
I think he was like anybody there, like any young soldier with the license to do anything they wanted. And for young soldiers at the time that could kill, rape, and did any other atrocity, that was part of war.
Pizarro joined up with another soldier, Diego de Almagro, and the pair earned a reputation for their ruthlessness in dealing with the natives.
In Panama, Pizarro and Almagro had a living, and that the main income of this living came from their ability to capture runaway Indians. So their first fame was as those two guys that are able to catch any Indian at any cost.
Once captured, Indians were treated like animals. Pizarro excelled at torture. He was known for burning the eyes of Indian chiefs to get their gold.
Exemplary punishments, cruel punishments like cutting off hands and feet, cutting off noses, cutting off ears, were often resorted to.
By 1522, Pizarro was 44. He had a comfortable life in Panama, but wanted much more. He'd seen how other ruthless adventurers had plundered massive fortunes. A fellow Spaniard, Cortés, had conquered Mexico and accumulated great wealth by seizing Aztec gold.
News travelled fast, and it was, in a sense, the desire to find something similar or even richer than what Cortés found in Mexico, which persuaded Pizarro and his companions to start probing down the Pacific coast.
In 1526, Pizarro and Almagro set sail from Panama to conquer the unexplored lands of the south. After months without finding anything, the men were mutinous.
So some of the soldiers complained in secret to the governor of Panama, and the governor of Panama sent another ship to pick them up.
Pizarro's starving men had camped on a hostile island off the coast of Colombia called the Isla del Gallo. When the rescue boat arrived, Pizarro was furious at the lack of loyalty. He took his sword and drew a line in the sand, demanding those who wanted to carry on to cross it.
To some degree, Pizarro's decision to draw a line in the sand, it was a risk. It was a risk which paid off because he eventually succeeded.
Of the original 160 men, only 13 crossed the line. The others returned to Panama and safety. Pizarro eventually reached the Peruvian coastline and landed at the town of Tumbes. The local Indians had never seen Europeans before. The heavily armored Spaniards who emerged from huge wooden ships were like aliens to them.
They live in the sea, in a house made out of wood. Nobody makes a house of wood here, okay? But not only that, they have iron. Some of them have like a tail for the sword, okay? They have wool in the face, like my llama, wool in the face. Okay? Wow.
The locals gave the Spaniards gold, silver, and precious stones. They told stories of great cities containing unimaginable riches. Pizarro had found his El Dorado, but had to be patient. This historic meeting of races meant nothing. Pizarro simply ordered one of his soldiers to scout the town for a future attack when he returned with reinforcements. Pizarro went back to Spain and triumphantly headed for the town of his birth.
Pizarro was drawn to his hometown of Trujillo, partly because of its tradition by now of sending fit, able, competent young men, many with some sort of military experience, to America. He was drawn by the whole family network.
He recruited his half-brothers, Gonzalo, Juan, and Hernando.
One of the strong links was blood link. If you can trust somebody, it has to be your blood. So in that sense, it was very helpful that they had all these brothers around. And at the end, if they gain something, it's still within the family.
Before he could return to Peru, Pizarro needed approval from the Spanish king, Charles V.
The monarchy was an enthusiastic supporter of the idea that it might become richer and more powerful, and that through the monarchy, Spain, Spanish civilization would become more important, greater, more recognized by the rest of Western European Christendom.
Charles V was about to extend his territory. 2,000 miles away in Peru, the Inca Empire was in disarray.
There had been a vicious civil war in Peru before the Spaniards arrived.
This civil war was between rival Incas. Huascar had been beaten by his brother, Atahualpa.
The civil wars weakened the Incas so that when they faced the Spaniards, they were clearly not at the top of their power.
Unlike the vulnerable Incas, the Spanish were well trained in the art of conquest.
Remember that the Spaniards were coming out of 700 years of constant struggle and combat against the Moors. These were people that have been bred for 700 years, generation after generation of warriors.
Pizarro returned to Tumbes in April 1532. In the 4 years he'd been away, the town had been ravaged by the civil war.
He realized from the reception that he got in Tumbes that he was not going to have to fight his way through Peru. And I think he was then very quickly aware that the majority of the Indians with whom he first came into contact were not going to resist him.
Seizing the opportunity provided by a divided nation, Pizarro gave the order to cross the Tumbes River and head south into the unknown heart of Atahualpa's Inca Empire. They marched to the city of Cajamarca, where Atahualpa would meet them.
Atahualpa and his men came to Cajamarca, probably without a very clear idea of precisely how they were going to deal with these strange men. What they weren't prepared for was the ferocity, the savagery of the Spanish attack.
The Incas were expecting a peaceful encounter. Pizarro saw this as an opportunity to seize power.
When Atahualpa arrives in Cajamarca, there is a small group of Spaniards that approach him. The other group of Spaniards are within the different buildings that surrounded the square and are ready with weapons.
The Spanish were not in the mood for negotiation. Pizarro said he was an ambassador from a great king overseas. His priest urged Atahualpa to reject his false idols and worship the true Christian God.
The friar Valverde handed a religious book to Atahualpa. Atahualpa almost unwittingly played his part in the script by throwing away that symbol of the true religion of Spanish superiority.
With the excuse he needed, Pizarro ordered the attack. In an act of unrestrained savagery, his men drew their arms and began shooting into the crowd. The shocked Incas were thrown into panic.
For the Incas, the Spanish might have been seen as something absolutely overwhelming, a force of nature maybe.
These people were shot not only with guns but with cannons, and also horses were thrown to them. It was just panic.
In the confusion, Atahualpa was dragged from his throne and captured, while the mounted Spanish soldiers tore into the fleeing Incas. Over 2,000 Incas died, and 5,000 were captured. More importantly for Pizarro, the native emperor was his hostage.
They knew that they have one key individual that was the leader. If you take the leader, everybody else will fall.
In a bloody double cross, Francisco Pizarro had captured the head of the mighty Incan Empire. He was now in a prime position to conquer this new world and satisfy his lust for power and gold. Francisco Pizarro had launched his conquest of Peru and taken the Incan Emperor Atahualpa hostage. He saw him as a prized asset.
You have to understand that Pizarro's behavior is nothing but the same behavior of a contemporary kidnapper who will always take care of his or her victim first and will go to extremes to guarantee his livelihood.
Pizarro wanted to get his hands on the wealth of the Incan Empire and demanded vast sums of gold and silver as Atahualpa's ransom. The petrified Incas filled 2 rooms full of gold and silver for the Spaniards.
Gold was usually associated with the sun and silver was associated with the moon. So that the proper way to revere the sun god was to produce golden objects. When the Incas discovered that the Spaniards were basically after gold, for them it must have been a shock because these were basically religious objects that were used for ritual.
Pizarro didn't care about the cultural significance of these artifacts. He began melting them down into gold bars.
When all had been melted down, the Spaniards had 13,000 pounds weight of gold. That's about 6 tons of gold, and 26,000 tons of silver in bars.
Pizarro's men had been promised fortunes when they set out. After their military success, they were each rewarded with a share of the booty.
They were obsessed by gold because they never saw that amount of gold in their lives. And they got so much that everything became very expensive. You want to buy a horse, you had to pay the amount of money you could buy 3 houses in Spain. Why? Because everybody had gold.
While Pizarro satisfied the greed of his men for the time being, he kept up a facade of friendship with his prisoner.
Pizarro had a very strong relationship with Atahualpa, It was openly strong, it was well rehearsed, but it was only because it was in his best interest. It was part of his policy.
Atahualpa remained under close guard. He grew increasingly dependent on the Spanish and was even coerced into ordering the death of his rival brother, Huasca. Pizarro had stayed long enough in Cajamarca. His scouts told him of many new territories offering greater riches. After 12 months in captivity, Atahualpa was outgrowing his usefulness.
I think Pizarro knew that if he was going to take control of this empire, that killing Atahualpa would not only get rid of an enemy who'd served his purpose, it would assist him in projecting himself to the very heart of the Inca Empire.
After befriending the fallen emperor, Pizarro betrayed him. Atahualpa was found guilty of treason and condemned to death by burning at the stake. For the Incas, the sentence was horrific. They believed that burning would deny their emperor an afterlife. In order to keep his soul, Atahualpa was forced to accept baptism. He was then garroted in Cajamarca on the 26th of July, 1533. Pizarro marched on the ancient city of Cusco, the spiritual home of the Incas. It was the last bastion of potential rebellion. To avoid conflict, he offered the Inca monarchy a share of power.
He was prepared to do a deal with the Inca elite in Cusco. So it's a skillful combination of force and diplomacy.
Pizarro crowned a puppet king, Manco Inca.
Manco Inca was used by the Spaniards. He was prepared to collaborate with them in return for being given the title of Inca, and in return for his extended family being, in theory, confirmed in its position.
Now dominant in the city, Pizarro encouraged his soldiers to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They looted religious temples for gold and took any Incan woman they fancied. Mixed-race children were a useful way of cementing the Spanish presence.
This is where you see this politics of mixing bloods very conveniently. He would never allow an indigenous noble girl to marry a man that was not part of Pizarro's team.
Pizarro was also in dispute with his old partner, Almagro, who felt he and his men hadn't had a proper share in the spoils of conquest. To placate him, Pizarro sent Almagro to the unknown lands to the south, where he could claim what he found as his own. Francisco Pizarro left Cusco to set up his new capital of Lima on the coast. He left two of his brothers in charge of Cusco, but Juan and Gonzalez lacked the leadership powers of their half-brother.
We have a number of accounts of the Spaniards fulfilling the almost stereotyped role of aggressive, ignorant, greedy, bloodthirsty conquerors.
The conquistadors were out of control. Their greed and bad behavior caused resentment amongst the Incas.
It was so rude and so rough that a few of them left everything, went back to Spain after seeing what was going on.
In 1535, the frustrated puppet leader Manco Inca was caught trying to raise resistance against the Spanish. He was clapped in irons, tortured, and publicly humiliated.
Well, Manco's life is tragic. He starts as a puppet Inca. He then is humiliated. He was at least clever enough to run away.
One night, Manco slipped out of Cusco and grouped together a significant Incan army. Now, the Incas were fighting not only for their lives, but for the existence of their race. In May 1535, the oppressed people of Cusco rose up and fought the Spanish forces in the hills above the city. Despite their limited technology, the Incas managed to take control.
They certainly succeeded in capturing the city of Cusco, which they held for about a week.
The Incas may have beaten the Spanish had Pizarro's old partner Almagro not returned from his expedition to reinforce the struggling Spanish forces.
He arrived back, however, in Cusco just in time to ensure that Manco Inca's revolt would not succeed. And he then installed himself in command in Cusco.
Almagro still felt cheated by Pizarro. His conquest to Chile had been fruitless. He decided to take matters into his own hands.
There was a power struggle, effectively, between Almagro and Pizarro, each of whom could claim with some justice to have the crown on his side.
Pizarro wanted to get rid of his troublesome partner, but he was now the respectful governor of Lima and didn't want to get his hands dirty by murdering a successful conquistador and subject of the king.
It was he who had authorized his brother Hernando to put together the force which defeated Almagro.
Almagro was caught and executed in Cuzco. His head was displayed as a warning to other would-be rebels. With the threat to his power extinguished, Pizarro played the part of a Spanish colonial governor.
He built himself a governor's palace on the main square in Lima. He essentially enjoyed the fruits of his success in Peru.
In 1541, Don Francisco Pizarro was 63 years old. One evening, a band of assassins surprised him as he ate dinner in his residence. Although he fought desperately, he was overpowered and slain. He was killed by the avenging son of Almagro, his former friend.
The fatal blow went through his jawbone, through his jugular, and actually severed the upper part of his spine, his spinal column. There were, I think, 70 other wounds found on the remains. He was the subject of a violent, frenzied attack. It was certainly, in a very obvious way, revenge by the Almagrists.
After successfully conquering a nation and destroying an indigenous race, Francisco Pizarro was murdered by his own people.